Last week, the world was introduced to young Rock and its wonderful cast of characters. This week, we focus on the Johnson family in 1987. As Teen Dwayne tries to impress fine-ass Karen, Rocky Johnson tries to impress everyone. And we learn what happens when someone uses the F word. We're talking Young Rock Season 1, Episode 2 on Pro Wrestling Repackaged. Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining us again. My name is Chris.
And my name is Tessa.
And this week we're discussing Season 1, Episode 2 of Young Rock, On the Road Again. But before we dive in, let's just chat a little bit about the general reaction to last week's premiere. A lot was going on, a lot of people checking out the show. A lot of people, in fact, it was NBC's best comedy premiere in 4 years with 5 million overnight viewers. So Young Rock in the first week, a ratings success.
That's really surprising to me. I didn't expect it to be the top show in the past 4 years. I guess that just goes to show that The Rock has that much power in the entertainment industry.
Yeah, people will check out a project if Dwayne Johnson is involved, apparently. And that was just overnight viewers. So I'm sure, with things like DVR and Hulu and Peacock, I'm sure many more have checked out the premiere by this point. But we've also seen some ratings and reactions from critics and audiences rolling in over the past week. And Rotten Tomatoes currently has Young Rock at an 88% fresh score from critics, which is pretty good for Rotten Tomatoes, I'd say. 93% audience score as well. Metacritic has it at a score of 67 with generally favorable reviews. And the IMDb score as of recording is 6.8. Now, IMDb, anytime I'm watching a show and I look at the IMDb score and I'm like, oh, really? It's that low? But Young Rock is, I think, holding up pretty well to critical reception.
It's also just the first episode, so people are probably being especially nitpicky.
We have seen some of that, yeah. The reactions from wrestling fans in general, mostly positive from what I've seen on Twitter, but there are a few nitpickers out there, as you've said, things like, oh, these wrestlers wouldn't have been in this territory at this time, that kind of stuff. But, and we talked about this show is not supposed to be a documentary.
It's not that serious. It's an NBC sitcom done by The Rock.
Yeah.
I think people going into this for some reason would be expecting some darker, seedy side of wrestling.
Well, we do get that kind of underbelly of the wrestling business in this episode, but it's being portrayed from a comedic standpoint as opposed to a gritty drama. And even some of the things that we would get in Glow, or perhaps Stephen Amell's upcoming show Heels, how that will portray the wrestling business. This is a family sitcom. This is a family comedy on NBC. We're not going to be getting Jake Roberts in Beyond the Mat level drama and kind of the fall from grace story that a lot of wrestling fans have come to know over the years of stars like Rocky Johnson from this era.
This isn't an episode of The Dark Side of the Ring or anything like that. It's lighthearted family comedy.
And I think it succeeds at that. And so I think the majority of wrestling fans that I've seen have judged it on that basis and in that context. And I think they've been enjoying it. But, wrestling fans can be a nitpicky bunch, just like comic book fans, oh, well, this was this in the comics and this was this in the comics. It's like, okay, but we're doing something different. We're telling a different story here and you can have a different interpretation of things. This is The Rock's story. It's not some team of writers getting these details of 80s wrestling wrong. It's how can we frame this for general audiences? Because the general audiences don't care if the Iron Sheik was wrestling in Polynesian pro wrestling in 1982. They don't care. They don't care if Junkyard Dog was in that territory. They don't care about that stuff. They're interested in these characters and the story that they're telling. So I don't think that a lot of these small details matter as much. Overall, I think this has been doing a great job of portraying period wrestling and The Rock's family history, but not doing it in a way where it's like you're watching a documentary. We're doing it in a way where we're watching a family sitcom here.
I don't think anyone is going to be able to tell this story the way The Rock is able to tell this story. And luckily, he is the one telling the story. So I don't really think fans kind of sitting there being like, but this didn't happen exactly like this is really, I don't think they have the right to do that.
Right, sure. And that's not to say that if there's something that we ever catch that, oh, I don't remember that being like that, or we know from, history that this was this and not really this, we'll point things out as we notice them, and we certainly won't notice everything because we weren't even alive during the time period that the majority of this show takes place. But that's not to say that there's nothing to be said for, well, here's the real history. The real history is important, but this is also a fictional show. This is a comedy, so I think we're judging it on that basis and in that context.
Right.
Also, just wanted to mention real quick that we got a nice little surprise in our first review on Apple Podcasts. So I just want to thank Lightbulb86, who left that review for us, a very nice review. And thank you to everyone who also reached out to us on social media after last week's episode. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate you listening, of course. And with that, it is now time for this week's edition of The Rock Says.
The Rock says, The Rock says.
What's The Rock saying?
So each episode, we choose our favorite quote from The Rock or Young Dwayne. Tessa, why don't you kick it off?
This episode was a little rough picking one because I think most of the best quotes from the show actually came from The Rock's parents.
Yeah.
So my actual favorite finally came at the end where he says, like my dad, I had been exaggerating the truth to make myself look good. But when I finally got real and chose to be there for him over impressing the girl, I somehow got the girl.
Kind of the moral of the story for this episode, which was a nice note to end on, I feel like. Well, my favorite quote from this episode was from the conversation between Teen Dwayne and Rocky Johnson, where Rocky Johnson is giving him some advice on how to attract girls and impress girls and deal with fine-ass Karen. And technically, this is still The Rock Says because Rocky Johnson is technically a rock. My favorite quote is Rocky Johnson going, "You just need to figure out what you can offer her that no one else can." And Teen Dwayne says, "My Hans and Franz impression from Saturday Night Live." And then Rocky goes, "I don't know what that means, son, but you got to step your game up."
I refuse to believe that Rocky Johnson does not know Hans and Franz.
Do you think Rocky Johnson was watching Saturday Night Live in the early 80s?
You're right. He was probably the only thing he was doing in 1987 was focusing on wrestling.
This man is out making the towns. He's out working at flea markets and
harassing the mailman.
Yes, harassing postal workers about his glory days. So let's dive into the episode now. Young Rock Season 1, Episode 2, On the Road Again, directed by Dana Reed and Jeffrey Walker, and written by Jeff Chiang and Nanachka Khan. So The Rock and Randall Connection are doing another sit-down interview, this time at The Rock's high school, Freedom High School. In the Dwayne Johnson Library, no less. How do you like that?
I want to go to the Dwayne Johnson Library.
Yeah. I wonder if it's just all copies of The Rock Says. So Rock is giving us the dirt about his mistakes and screw-ups as a teenager, including being a shoplifter. As we know, young Dwayne went through a trinkets phase. Atta and Rocky actually open up a cleaning business when money is tight, and as we know, Teen Dwayne himself is slinging pizza with his friend Gabe, like we saw in the last episode. But his attention is focused on girls, mainly the aforementioned fine-ass Karen. Meanwhile, Rocky Johnson is reliving his glory days of the early 80s, taking small local and regional independent bookings just to keep the dream alive.
Now, this part of the episode, when we focus on Rocky Johnson, this seems to be pretty consistent with The Rock's book, The Rock Says, because he says that this was happening in the late 80s when his dad was starting to fall by the wayside in the wrestling industry. In the book, he says, professional wrestlers struggle mightily against the inevitable, the day when they will not be able to perform, when the back gives out in the middle of a body slam or the knee pops while climbing the turnbuckle. For my father, that day arrived at the end of the 1980s, and as is often the case, his fall from grace was swift and harsh. Once a world champion, he was now reduced to bit player status. He would take work wherever he could find it. If a small regional promoter needed someone to come in for the night and throw his body around for $100, Rocky Johnson would do it. He had to. He was trained for nothing else.
Last week was all about working the gimmick, and this week is really about kind of keeping the gimmick alive, keeping the dream alive, and not really being able to come to grips with reality that you are not where you once were. You are not at the highest point of your career anymore. You're on the downslope, and things are not pretty from here on out for Rocky Johnson.
And on some level, he must know that that's happening because, as The Rock says, his parents started their own cleaning business. But we don't really see Rocky doing anything. It seems to all fall on The Rock's mom.
Yeah. Not that he's not putting in hard work, but he's still out chasing down his dream. And, we see this wrestling flashback to start things off here. Rocky Johnson versus Ric Flair from April 16th, 1982 in Eugene, Oregon. And this match actually did happen in Pacific Northwest Wrestling, which was an NWA territory. And this match was for the NWA Championship. Now, Rocky was not successful in challenging for the title, and nor was he the prior 2 times on April 12th or 15th. They were doing the loop around Oregon with this Flair versus Johnson match. Ric Flair here is being portrayed by Matthew Farrelly, a.k.a. Matty Wahlberg, who's a wrestler out of Sydney. What did you think about this portrayal of Ric Flair versus Rocky Johnson from 1982?
I think the wrestling looks really good. We talked about that in the last episode. I just can't get over this Ric Flair hair.
Yeah, it was the wig.
I think it needed to be poofier. I wonder what Ric Flair thinks of this.
Yeah, I did not check to see if he tweeted anything about it. But this version of Flair did kind of give me, at first, maybe like a Skid Marks from Tough Enough vibe. And then also Buddy Landel, who, if you don't know Buddy Landel, look him up. Wrong nature boy there. So flash to 1987, where the entire story takes place this episode, which, last episode, obviously the premiere, the pilot, they wanted to give us a taste of each time period, 82, 87, and 90. This episode, spending all of its time in 87, definitely makes things feel more focused and gives us a little bit more room to stretch our legs, so to speak, and stop kind of rushing from one little bit to the next, which tells me that we're not always going to be rushing from quick story to quick story to quick story. That's necessary, I believe, for the pilot and to get people hooked and to give, like I said, to give them a taste of what's to come. But we really got to kind of stretch out in 87 here, and I enjoyed it.
Yeah, having all 3 in the premiere served its purpose. It did a great job with that. But now having just each episode be dedicated to one specific timeline, it's really going to be able to get us more comfortable and in depth with a specific version of Dwayne. So I really like that.
Right. So each episode is, okay, I'm going to tell you this specific story rather than throwing a handful of stories out each episode, which might have gotten a little bit hard to keep track of as episodes went on. Wait, where are we? What are we doing? So I also wanted to highlight Bradley Constant, who plays Teen Dwayne in 87, and I really think he's doing a great job. When I think of this show in my head now, I think the first person I see is Bradley Constant as 87 Dwayne. I think he made that much of an impact in the pilot, mainly because we spent the most time with him, but he was also very memorable in the role, I think.
Yeah, and I think so far, going from the first episode to this episode, I think he's had some of the best moments in the show.
Oh, for sure.
So he's really captivating.
Yeah,
in that way.
he was there for the whole saga of Waffle.
Yes, he was.
And this episode, he gets to do his great Hans and Franz.
And we've watched a few interviews from Bradley, and you can tell that he's genuinely a fan of The Rock. He says that he's been watching him since he was like 2 years old. So he probably is able to kind of bring that energy to the table.
He looked up to The Rock because he says he saw a guy who looks like an older version of me. It's crazy to think about how so many people idolized The Rock back in the Attitude Era, and back in the early 2000s. But for someone like Bradley Constant, it's like, wow, this is what I can achieve. This is what I can aspire to be. And look, here he is now playing a younger version of that man that he idolized, which I think is really, really cool.
That has to be so crazy for him.
Yeah. I'm always a sucker for the moment you see someone's dream coming true when they land that first big role, or maybe an indie wrestler when they finally sign to a big company. So I really enjoyed watching some interviews with Bradley over the past week. I think he just has such a great positive vibe about him, a positive energy. He seems like a really good kid. And I think that he's going to do a lot in his career. I think that this will be a springboard for him. And this is one of his first roles and definitely his first major role. So I think at this point, it's only upwards for Bradley Constant.
Yeah. And you'd have to assume that since The Rock had a hand in the casting, he was really able to see some of himself in Bradley.
Yeah.
So that has to just be a huge compliment.
Yeah. That's probably one of the bigger compliments you can get as a young actor. The Rock handpicked you to play a younger version of him in a show all about him. So yes, very impressed with Bradley Constant so far. So we're in 1987, and the Johnson family, at this point in their life, they're buying store brands, which is very relatable. Ata really wants this purple half and half milk, but she has to buy Sim's market brand milk alternative because, quote, no one is making half and half money. We're making Sim's market brand money.
Now, look, I love a good store brand for things like potato chips or oat milk. But Dwayne's right here. You can't settle for that store brand pop. You need the real Coke. It's not the same.
Oh, all soda is carbonated garbage.
It's not the same.
Yes, and we are a pop versus soda couple because
It's pop.
we came from different states and people here are really weird.
It's pop. This episode is taking place in Pennsylvania. It is pop.
The real question is, does The Rock prefer Sheetz or Wawa? You did not get an answer from him on that.
I
But
did
hopefully
not
at some
get
point
an
we
answer.
will.
That's the real... Look, if he's running for president in 2032, a big issue in Pennsylvania, we need the answer. Is it Sheetz or is it Wawa? It's Sheetz, obviously.
Well, I have never experienced a Wawa.
Neither have
but
I. I don't need to.
You have indoctrinated me into Sheetz culture, which is the gas station is also our favorite restaurant. So that has definitely been interesting, but I've never experienced Wawa. Listeners, if you have experienced Wawa or Sheetz, tweet us at pwrepackaged or email us pwrepackaged@gmail.com and let us know what you prefer. So at this point, Ata is cleaning houses and Rocky is taking any booking that he can get. And we see a phone conversation between Rocky Johnson and Teen Dwayne. And Rocky is giving him some advice about how to deal with fine-ass Karen, how to impress her. And as I said in my quote earlier, he's saying, figure out what you can offer to her that no one else can. And for Teen Dwayne, the only thing he can think of, or the thing that immediately comes to mind for him, which is very telling, is his Hans and Franz impression. So what this tells me is that Teen Dwayne, even at that point, realized there is something in him that he's just a natural entertainer. And his first inclination is to go and do this little performance for her. Whatever you want to say about it, that his first inclination is, I'm going to go out and I'm going to entertain and I'm going to make people laugh.
I think that goes hand in hand with him going around telling people that his name is Tomas, as opposed to Dwayne. He's creating a character for himself to play.
Early on, very early on. You start young. So Rocky tells Dwayne, don't hesitate. Don't wait to make the first move, because there's always some other guy who can come along and swoop your girl up before you have a chance.
And that guy's going to tell that girl that she looks better with no makeup on.
Yes, the classic, I appreciate your natural beauty line. I always think of Steve from Full House telling DJ that she looks better without makeup, and then Danny and Jesse making fun of him for that. But this is basically Rocky telling Dwayne to strike first. This is a Johnny and Miguel conversation here, if ever there was one.
You just really want that crossover.
Yes.
Here we go again.
Yes, I will be tying everything that I possibly can back to Cobra Kai, as I do in real life, as you well know. So I apologize in advance, or you're welcome if you're a Cobra Kai fan. So the amount of time that Teen Dwayne is still spending on trying to impress people, it does not seem like Waffle's lesson really sunk in with him fully, or so it seems at this point in the episode.
Yeah, I mean, he's 15, so he just kind of jumps around, I think.
Yeah.
His dad's telling him something, so he's probably going to listen to that more than the crackhead in the back seat.
But you'd have to imagine that the Waffle experience scarred him in a way, and that's something that he'll never forget.
How could you?
So if that happened to me, I know that I would be living by those words every day. That man with his last breaths was giving Teen Dwayne some sage advice. I would be following that to the letter.
Well, maybe Dwayne went to his dad and said, hey, this homeless guy, Waffle, told me all of this. And Rocky had to set him straight as his father.
I don't know what that means, son, but... So Teen Dwayne, decked out in his finest stolen clothing, which includes some very bright purple jeans, is denied entry to the bus because, again, he looks like a grown-ass man.
Now, first of all, this is a much better outfit, in my opinion, than his stolen clothes in the first episode.
The Woody Woodpecker.
I'm a big fan of these purple jeans.
I think he looks like the Joker. It's those bright purple pants, man. And anyone with bright purple pants will immediately make me think of the Joker.
I used to have like metallic looking purpley pink pants. That's what it
Where
reminded
are those
me.
now? Did we
That's
put
what
them
they-
in the donations?
They're long gone, but that's what these pants reminded me.
Ata shows up to clean a new client's house. This client is very wealthy. The client's name is Diane, and she is a rich white woman in the 80s. So she is extremely talkative and has very large hair.
Yeah, 80s hair is always a choice. I'm glad that The Rock's mom seems to have avoided that.
She gives me a very Debbie from Glow vibe, does Diane. It's probably mostly the
It's
hair,
the
but
hair.
also her face too. She kind of just resembles Debbie from Glow and kind of almost has the same disposition, at least early Debbie.
I think it is mostly the hair. It's the same, like, kind of crinkly 80s hair.
It's like a sculpture almost. It's like a sculpture on your head. So Diane is very talkative, extremely talkative, much to Ata's chagrin. And Ata's just trying to clean this house, and Diane just won't leave her alone. And she's just talking about her problems and her ex-husband and this, and he's buying me these gifts, and he's buying me a treadmill and a bike and diet pills and blah, blah, blah. And Ata finally snaps and says, "These aren't real problems. I'm trying to pay bills here. I'm trying to raise a kid. And you're talking to me about the gifts that your ex-husband bought you."
One of the things about this episode that I thought was the strongest was the emphasis on Ata and what she is dealing with. And I'd like to see more of that going forward. I like learning about her and what she's doing because I think it's easy to get caught up in whatever Dwayne's doing. But I really liked this emphasis on her.
Yeah. I mean, she's not the public figure
Right.
that so many of The Rock's other family members are. You know, Peter Maivia and Leah Maivia being such a huge presence in Polynesian wrestling and Rocky Johnson being this huge wrestling star in the early 80s. Ata Johnson is a mother trying to glue everyone together and keep the family together and keep the bills paid and manage her husband who's off, doing his wrestling stuff and manage her son who's trying to impress girls and buy cars and
Trying to buy name brand pop.
Yes, name brand pop and Joker jeans. Can't be buying that name brand pop. Yeah, Ada's she's gotta put her foot down somewhere. So Teen Dwayne and Gabe are back working at El Nostimo Pizzeria. And Dwayne is lamenting the fact that he missed his opportunity to impress fine-ass Karen because he was late for school due to being denied bus access.
Yeah, they think he's too old.
How do you think he got to school? Do you think
Probably
he went and found
ran.
that car?
Oh no. I bet he
Well,
walked.
that's evidence now.
Yeah.
So we learn from Gabe that Karen has crazy high standards and is just frequently unimpressed on dates and asks to be taken home even when the date is at her own house. That was a fun little sequence of her just, take me home, take me home, take me home.
This is your home.
Yeah, we're at your house. So it's at this point that the Karens roll up to the pizza place to the soundtrack of Point of No Return by Expose. Great needle drop there. A classic 80s hit. And the Karens, first of all, I'm a big fan of the Karens. The Karens consist of fine-ass Karen, who we know, big hair Karen, colorblind Karen, and Bonnie, who is an honorary Karen because it's her car.
I want to know, in the 80s, how many friend groups were there that everyone just has the same name? Because everyone in my school was pretty much a Caitlin, but I don't think they were all friends like that.
Yeah, I remember in school there being a lot of Jessicas, a lot of Katies, a lot of Amandas, but I get a total Heathers vibe from the Karens. So fine-ass Karen still thinks that Teen Dwayne's name is Tomas at this point. And Tomas is just over there at their table, just bragging about his dad's wrestling career, which actually impresses the Karens because this is the 80s. Hulkamania was a big thing. WWF in general was a big thing. This was a big boom period for wrestling. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that she would be very impressed at Tomas talking about his dad being this big wrestler. And she even says that her dad ordered WrestleMania 3, right?
Yeah. So she was hoping that maybe Rocky was a part of that, but he was not.
Yeah, he's working the local territories, the local shows, very small, but Dwayne does not want to let on that is the case. He's still trying to portray that his dad is this big star on the major stage.
Even at this point, if you're not actively watching wrestling, you are in some way familiar with it because you have non-Karen, Bonnie, recognize wrestler's named Andre the Giant from the movie The Princess Bride.
That is a great movie.
It's a really good movie. Yeah, I like that one.
Perhaps something that we can examine on this very podcast.
Maybe
a bonus episode. So it's at this point that Teen Dwayne decides that it's time to break out the big guns. It's time to break out his Hans and Franz. And what do you know? It works.
Now, here's the thing. I love Hans and Franz. I love that.
Who doesn't love Hans and Franz?
I love that SNL sketch. I love Dana Carvey. That impersonation could use some work, which leads me to believe that Karen might actually have lower standards than we were led to believe.
Well, I think maybe she was already impressed by Tomas's dad being Rocky Johnson. So let me ask you something. Do you think The Rock still breaks out his Hans and Franz from time to time?
Look, he claims it's real, that he really did that. I think we need an updated Hans and Franz impression from Dwayne The Rock Johnson. Get on that.
If Randall was any kind of journalist, he would have asked Rock for an updated Hans and Franz. That could clinch the election for him in 2032.
I think that's a deal maker.
That's his key to victory.
If he claims he has a Hans and Franz impersonation, then we need to see it.
We see another wrestling flashback. This time it's Rocky Johnson versus Roddy Piper from June 9th, 1984 in Landover, Maryland. This is also a recreation of an actual match that happened in which Rocky Johnson lost in 6 minutes, despite recapping the match as if he won to a disinterested mailman that tells him, I don't even really watch wrestling.
Do you think the mailman's lying? Rocky thinks he's lying.
He's probably lying just to get away from Rocky Johnson. Rocky Johnson at this point seems like a Virgil type who will just stop you and talk your ear off about
the glory days.
The glory days. Piper here, Roddy Piper, is portrayed by a wrestler named Jade Drain, who is from New Zealand. I thought it was pretty good.
Yeah, I think this one looked better. And I don't think we've mentioned this before, but Chavo Guerrero is helping with the wrestling scenes.
Yes, Chavo Guerrero working in choreography as he did on Glow.
Right.
So I'm glad that Chavo got another gig after Glow was canceled.
Good
because
for
I
Chavo.
thought that the wrestling sequences in Glow were pretty well done as well. So Teen Dwayne is very happy, and he tells Rocky Johnson that his advice about Karen worked. And Rocky Johnson just goes, smooth as hell, son. Which I loved. I love Rocky Johnson. I love Joseph Lee Anderson as Rocky Johnson. He might be my favorite character.
He's so good at it. Like, he looks just like him. I think he portrays it so well. I think the portrayal of The Rock's parents here is so well done.
Yeah, very, very, very well cast, I think. I think that Joseph Lee Anderson not only has a great delivery and just has such a charisma about him, but just the look itself just lends itself so well to comedy.
I think that works, though, with the reliving of the glory days because he looks very early 80s, 70s.
Yeah.
And we're in 1987, and he's still carrying this look of a not forgotten era, but the past.
It's like Jerry Seinfeld's bit about, you always know what the best years of your dad's life were because his fashion is frozen in time from that point on or something like that. But all is not well for Rocky because he is having some pay issues with promoters, and we know how promoters can be. But he tells Atta that he's going to be paid at the next show that he has coming up at Northampton College, which is, quote, totally sold out. So now Teen Dwayne back at school has a run-in with Principal Bog, who we are meeting for the first time, who is asking him for a briefing on his undercover investigation. So yes, this principal is actually convinced that Teen Dwayne is a narc.
Now, this is another thing that The Rock has, he's said that this is true. He's been live tweeting the shows. And so people have been commenting on these things, and he'll be like, that happened, that happened, that happened. And this is one of the things that he says is real, which kind of goes in line. He also says in his book that everyone thought he was older than he was because they thought he was using steroids too.
Oh, just wait till they see him later in life. Yeah, if you're not watching Young Rock live and you're not on Twitter as it's happening, definitely go back and check The Rock's timeline after it airs, after you watch it, because he definitely provides a lot of context for what was real, what actually happened. And it's just a really fascinating insight into not only kind of what went into these stories and how they're making this show, but just his life in general and what really made an impact on him when he was younger. And I just appreciate the fact that The Rock takes the time every week to sit down and talk to fans on Twitter, answer questions.
It feels like a passion project for him, while also at the same time, he could just be playing the long game for that presidential run.
Well, yeah, that too. Yeah, this could really all just be really one big publicity stunt for an eventual presidential campaign.
He's like, if I engage with the fans on Twitter, I'm going to be down to earth and they'll vote for me in 2032.
If this show gets like 10, 11 seasons, we could go right up until that race. Could you imagine?
It doesn't seem like shows go that long anymore.
Not anymore, no.
But
Not
if
anymore.
anybody can make that happen, Dwayne The Rock Johnson.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe some spinoffs. Maybe a waffle spinoff.
Spinoff.
I mean, Brian Gewirtz did tell us that, hey, anything's possible in TV. We could meet Waffle's brother Flapjack at some point. So if that does happen, you heard it here first.
That's season 2.
Straight from executive producer Brian Gewirtz, who we know was one of WWE's head writers and The Rock's personal writer and works on many projects with The Rock. So we appreciate that insight from Brian and maybe a taste of what is to come. And it definitely tastes like syrup. So Dwayne approaches the Karens and Bonnie, who says, you can also call me Karen.
I feel bad for Bonnie.
I feel bad for Bonnie, but she's going to wind up being the Winona Ryder character, isn't she?
They're taking advantage of her for her car, and she just wants to be a Karen.
Yeah.
I feel bad.
The other Karens got to watch their back because we see what happens in the movie Heathers. So Teen Dwayne invites fine-ass Karen to his dad's wrestling match, and he's bragging about, oh yeah, I can get us VIP passes, and we can hang out backstage. And at this point, fine-ass Karen turns around to Kevin, who is kind of The Rock's competition for fine-ass Karen's heart. And Karen turns around and goes, see, Kevin, that's how you do it. So we're definitely setting up some frustration on Kevin's end, and we'll see the boiling point that comes to later on in the episode. But just about this whole scene, the balls on Teen Dwayne to ask a girl out for a first date, and that date is to a wrestling match. Now, granted, his dad is a wrestler, but I could not imagine asking a girl out on a date in high school, a first date no less, and the plan is, let's go to a wrestling show.
It's not even that. It's she has to drive because he, of course, doesn't have a car.
Which is a total Allie/Samantha LaRusso move.
So she has to drive. He doesn't know exactly where this is. He's told by his father that it is at a college. And it's just a small little show. She's only familiar with WWE or WWF at this point, and he's going to impress her by taking her to this local little tiny wrestling show.
Yeah, well, he's under the impression at this point that they're going to be in an arena. There's going to be bleachers, there's going to be the pomp and circumstance of a wrestling show. And that's what Karen thinks as well.
I just think you'd want to get those details straight before you take her there.
Well, I mean, it's classic Rocky Johnson, making everything sound better than it is. He's working that gimmick. He's playing it up even to his own son, leading his son down this path of embarrassment and, potential romantic problems with fine-ass Karen. So back at Diane's house, Atta has made Diane some spam musubi as a peace offering after she kind of snapped at her the previous day. Can you tell us a little bit about spam musubi?
Yeah, it's a popular snack and lunch food composed of a slice of grilled spam sandwiched either in between or on top of a block of rice wrapped together with nori. So it's a take on Japanese cuisine. It's considered inexpensive and portable, and it's commonly found near cash registers in convenience stores all over Hawaii.
So as they're eating this dish, they're commiserating about family life, and Diane starts to open up to Atta and says, her daughter left home and she's divorced and lonely. And they start to bond over this. So that's when Diane quotes Sally Jesse Raphael, the yellow-haired hawk of daytime talk. And she says, we're expected to react to the needs of the people around us.
I like this scene between the two of them because I'm glad that, like I said before, that Atta's getting her own exposure here on this show. And it's good for her, I think, probably to have another woman to talk to. If you're surrounded by Dwayne and Rocky all day, every day, I can see where that would get a little frustrating.
Yeah. And I wonder if we'll see Diane in future episodes, or maybe in future episodes we'll see some different clients from when Atta was cleaning houses and kind of the shenanigans that they get her into. So back to Teen Dwayne and Karen. Karen is driving them up to this quote-unquote wrestling show, which turns out is at a flea market. It's located right between the vintage coats and the armoires. So needless to say, Karen is not happy about this. In fact, she is flat out terrified of being at a flea market. Now, I don't know what the connotation of flea markets was back in the 80s, but I went to flea markets, many a time when I was a kid. There was a local flea market I used to go and buy wrestling shirts from, these bootleg wrestling shirts. So that was always fun. But they are kind of weird. You have the ones with the knives and the guns, and that's a little freaky. And, it is what it is. I don't know. Maybe Karen just was never exposed to this type of environment coming from what I assume is a more upscale neighborhood and only being brought to the finest shopping malls.
Yeah, she's probably too rich for those. Anytime I've been to a flea market, I've never been scared or scandalized the way she is here, but it's just a fear of the unknown, I think.
So is at this point that Karen learns that Tomas is not Dwayne's real name. So Rocky Johnson kind of blowing up his spot there. So while Dwayne and Rocky are hashing this out, Rocky persuades Dwayne to stay and watch his match, because it's at this point that Karen wants to leave and Dwayne is going to go with her. But no, Dwayne makes the decision that he's going to stay and watch his dad's match. And we get a quote from 2032 Rock here, and he says, "Sure, my dad stretched the truth to make himself look good, but he was also used to a certain level of success that he wasn't ready to give up. Still working that gimmick."
Yeah, which is why it's surprising that he kind of ratted Dwayne out with his name here.
Really blowing up his spot and not helping Dwayne work his gimmick.
Yeah, come on. Respect your son a little bit.
Kayfabe.
He clearly had a gimmick going here.
That would have been great if Teen Dwayne was like, "Hey, Dad, kayfabe." oh, yes, I am sorry, my son Tomas.
Whose nickname is Dewey for some reason.
In a shocking turn of events, though, Karen begrudgingly, albeit, stays with Dwayne. She's not happy about this still. She is very freaked out about the atmosphere of the flea market and what the various people are selling.
She's also very disturbed by a racist syrup bottle.
Yes.
So she's woke.
I wouldn't give her that much credit. But she wants to know why Dwayne wants to stay. And he simply responds, "He's my dad." It's a few words that really say a lot about how young Dwayne felt about his dad.
Clearly at this point, he still idolizes him, even though he knows that his dad's kind of lying. His dad's making things up. It's not the same as what it was 10 years ago. He still has such a love and respect for his father. It's nice to see.
And he chooses family again over his crush. And, he really is, he is a good boy. He's got the heart of gold, even though he's a shoplifter, even though, The Rock says he gets into so much trouble. But really, at the end of the day, he had a heart of gold, and he sticks up for his family, and he chooses his family, which is, the heartwarming aspect of this show really showing itself yet again. This time, though, it pays off for him because Karen stays at the show, and not only does she stay, she gets into it.
Yeah, you know what it reminded me of in the first episode where they had that flashback of The Rock's grandmother watching his grandfather wrestle for the first time, and she's so shocked she's running into the ring. Fine-ass Karen here, she seemed like she would have ran in.
Oh, yeah, no, she's getting into it. She's yelling at the heel, who we will talk about in just a second. But I saw one really great tweet about this moment with Karen, and it's by @ScarlettE.Harris, and and she says, "Karen's Debbie moment." And it's a gif of Debbie from Glow in the crowd watching the wrestling match and going, "This whole thing is a soap opera." And that's when wrestling finally clicked in her mind for her when they went to that wrestling show. A lot of Debbie from Glow references, or at least
parallels.
Kind of parallels, in this episode.
You know what that reminds me of, though? I'm not sure if you know, but there was recently, I think just yesterday, an article on CNN discussing wrestling as an art form.
No, I haven't seen that.
Yeah, and so it's making all of these comparisons to theater and all of that stuff. So it kind of goes hand in hand with that Debbie experience.
So at this point, we check back in with Atta and Diane one last time, and they're watching some good old SJR. And Atta's talking about how exhausting it is that Rocky is always exaggerating to make himself look good, which, exhausting for young Dwayne too, as we see earlier on with him kind of getting into this predicament of taking his date to this flea market wrestling match. So exhausting for the entire family.
It seems like everyone has to kind of cover up for him. We saw Atta doing that in the first episode with 10-year-old Dwayne. We see Dwayne doing it in this episode for fine-ass Karen, kind of having to go along with his lies.
And Atta constantly having to, deal with the fact that, oh, Rocky didn't get paid again. He didn't stick up for himself. He didn't make sure he got paid up front, and kind of just manage that whole aspect while also dealing with his kind of delusional self-image. And I think it's important to note that Rocky seems to have the best of intentions, and all he wants to do is be a success, take care of his family, provide for them financially. So it's hard to really get mad at someone who is not only dealing with kind of the crushing reality that you're not where you once were in your career and you're on the downslope, but also someone who genuinely is just trying to do what he can.
And he definitely doesn't want to look bad in his son's eyes. He wants Dwayne to keep looking up to him. So that's probably part of why he exaggerates. He wants to look good to his son, to look like a success for his son. And you can't really blame him for that.
Yeah. And part of that, too, is also protecting the business
Right.
on the public side of things, and still maintaining this illusion that wrestlers kind of at that point had to live their whole lives trying to maintain. So a lot of interesting kind of insight into kind of the mentality of Rocky Johnson and the toll that takes on his family. Diane says that her ex-husband was basically a giant brain attached to the body of an uncooked chicken, but gives Atta some good advice about finding the, quote, little joys, for they give the greatest pleasures, which is another SJR gem.
I can relate to this because when I was in college and I'd be home in the afternoon, I'd be watching dumb shows like that. Me watching Maury every afternoon at 3.
Yeah, you love your trash TV. So back at the flea market wrestling match, the wild Samoans come out of nowhere and scare the crap out of Karen, which I enjoyed. Really just making her regret her decision to stay even more.
Well, how would you feel?
I would be delighted if the wild Samoans ran up to me
You're
going,
You're on a date with a guy who lied about his name, was wrong about where the date would be, and then you're forced to stick around because you're also his ride and he won't leave. And then you're getting harassed by his crazy uncles.
Things not going too well for Teen Dwayne at this point, but it was great to see Afa and Sika in this episode because, we saw them in 82 in the pilot, but I hope that, we get a lot more of this. We get to see a lot of that cast of characters popping up throughout the episodes, regardless of it's in 82 or 87 or 90, because it's one of the things that makes the show fun.
Well, yeah, and you have to imagine that wherever The Rock goes, because we see him in Hawaii, we see him in Bethlehem, then we're going to see him in Miami, wrestlers travel. They could easily just be at a show and pop in at any time during any of these timelines.
Yeah, and as we know from this episode, the Wild Samoans got Rocky Johnson on this show. So,
Right.
And they're getting him other bookings as well.
Yeah, he's going to Erie next.
Yeah.
Whole other side of the state.
So our main event of the flea market is Rocky Johnson versus the Gull. The Gull is billed as hailing from the ocean, and I want to note that the Gull is played by a man named Brian Gamage, a.k.a. Caveman Ugg. Caveman Ugg is a wrestler from Melbourne, and I am delighted not only by the Gull, but by Caveman Ugg. From what I have seen, I am delighted. I love just that name, Caveman Ugg.
It's a great name, but all I can think of are Uggs.
Oh, the boots?
The boots.
My mind immediately went to Ugly from Salute Your Shorts, before your time, but I'm sure someone out there will get it. So the match is underway, and the Gull gets heat as Karen is really getting into it, and Dwayne is, of course, spouting some wrestling insider jargon to impress her. Of course, she has no idea what he's talking about.
Very confused.
And I mean, we've all been there trying to explain wrestling to your significant other who you're sitting there showing it to. I never had that problem with you, but, there were a few girlfriends back in the day that didn't quite get this whole wrestling thing. So I tried to break it down for them. And I
How'd
probably
that go?
well, not good.
They didn't like it.
No.
No wrestling fans. You didn't make any wrestling fans out of them?
No, in fact, my first girlfriend gave me an ultimatum.
Oh.
She said, I think you should stop watching this wrestling stuff. And basically made me choose wrestling or her, which I said, okay, I'll continue watching wrestling. That was not our first or last breakup thing, so don't worry. So Karen, she's getting into it.
Mm-hmm.
She's yelling, she's screaming at the heel, things like, stop it, and I hate you, which I loved. Meanwhile, Rocky's just kind of sitting there and, you can just see in his head that he's like scientifically breaking down what's happening in the ring. So that mind for the business already there at this point. Rocky Johnson does a kip up and fires up on a comeback, hitting a drop kick and a sunset flip for the win. Karen's delighted. And then we get 2032 Rock saying the quote about choosing to be there for his dad and somehow getting the girl in the process. And, he's very proud of his dad, regardless of the circumstances of this whole situation.
I don't think it'll matter how much his dad kind of exaggerates, because in Dwayne's mind, those exaggerations are just his dad. That's who he is to him.
But at this point, it's the attack of the scummy promoter who shorts Rocky by $600 right in front of Karen. Not a good look, but Teen Dwayne covers for him by saying that, he does these small shows as a favor to my uncles, but the real money is at the big shows, which he then promises to take Karen to.
This is actually a nice parallel to earlier in the episode where he tells the Karens that he's just working at this pizza place as a character building exercise. He doesn't need the money.
Of course not. He's Tomas.
He's just trying to build up character.
Yeah, we all know that with his Hans and Franz impression, he's going to go out. He's probably going to get some big acting roles, be very successful at a young age. So he's just passing the time and, trying to learn what the commoners would do. So back at the Johnson residence, Rocky apologizes to Atta about being shorted by the promoter and coming home with only $300. But Atta's okay with it. She says, we can use that $300, but make sure you get paid up front in the future. And the fridge shot, which we get quite a bit in this show, this shot from inside the fridge, from this we see that Atta has treated herself to her little joy of half and half milk, which she deserves.
Yeah, good for her.
After spending all that time with Diane and dealing with all that, you deserve your half and half milk, your little purple milk.
But what I liked is she has to hide it behind some sort of melon, because otherwise Dwayne is just going to drink the entire thing.
Oh yeah, in one gulp, that'll be gone.
But he sees fruit, and he's like, no, not going near that.
What from the grocery store would be your little joy that you could pick up? Oat milk? Chips?
Yeah, but I can get chips no problem anywhere, anytime.
Well, it doesn't matter. It's just a little joy.
Probably my Silk chocolate almond milk yogurt.
Ah, you do love that.
It's really good yogurt.
My little joy is pretzels. I love them, and I hope they love me.
I'm sure they do.
We cut back to 2032 Rock, and Sandy, the publicist, is freaking out and trying to end the interview, which is a bit of a recurring gag at this point. And the best part of this is Randall snapping at him, telling him to get out of here and saying, bitch trying to step into my coverage.
I really like Randall in this show. I didn't know how I was going to feel about, this actor turned journalist, TV journalist talking about politics, but these little snide comments that he makes, or these just awkward things that he accidentally reveals too much, I think those are gold.
Yeah. I mean, we're only 2 episodes into this show, but I don't think we have talked enough about Randall and what he brings to these interview segments with The Rock.
It's a weird energy.
Yeah, it could be very easy to have all the energy focused on The Rock and to be completely overshadowed by The Rock, but I think Randall holds his own. That's why I called him the Rock and Randall connection. I think they are on equal footing here. So 2032 Rock says, no one's perfect and we all make mistakes. I just happen to make a whole hell of a lot of them. Which brings us back to 87 as Rock's in school, walks up to Karen at her locker, brings her a Rocky Johnson hat as he was telling her about some Rocky Johnson merch earlier. So
he promised a hat.
Making good on that promise. She compliments his purple Joker jeans and, she's just bragging to the other Karens about the match that they went to and talks about, he hit a sunset flip, which I think might be the most unrealistic thing in the show. The fact that she's just naming wrestling moves like the sunset flip, by name.
Yeah, so soon it seems a little out of character unless Dwayne was pulling her aside and be like, hey, tell everyone my dad did this.
Yeah, that's called a sunset flip, Karen. Yeah, I can do that too. So Kevin the jerk shows up and he tells Dwayne that, hey, maybe your dad can main event my neighbor's garage sale next week. And he's talking about how there was no one at that show anyway. My brother was there. He says there was 10 people there. There's 10 people here. This is the show. And then Kevin says the F word. And what happens when you say the F word? You get knocked out. Dwayne decks Kevin and says, never use the F word. So lessons learned in 1982 by Andre the Giant, applying all the way in 1987.
He sure remembered that one. And this is something that The Rock has said. He said he has gotten into fights at school because people would call wrestling fake. In his book, he says that when someone would come to him and say that stuff is all fake, it's all bullshit, my reply would always be, is wrestling fake? Well, I can show you better than I can tell you. Oh, really? How? Like this. Wham! Right cross. And this is just something that's just casually happening at school or anywhere.
Hey, Teen Dwayne shows no mercy. The Rock said on Twitter that, yeah, this did happen twice. In fact, in elementary school, he gave a kid a pile driver and he knocked out a kid in high school. And he got suspended both times. And he says, I was wrong, but back in the 80s, I was taught by my dad and all the wrestlers to always protect the business. It's what we did.
Well, he also said that when he started wrestling and in interviews and things, he would say, yeah, things are predetermined. We have scripts and all this stuff. He says his parents almost died when they heard him saying that. Because to them, it was still something that very much had to be protected, even in the late 90s, when we all know the truth. Thanks, Vince McMahon.
It's amazing how much the wrestling business has changed now compared to back then. And that wasn't that long ago. It really wasn't.
No, now every wrestler with a wrestling name, they have their real name as their display name on social media.
And their Twitch handle. So that was episode 2. You know, I gotta say, I thought this flew by. I thought it was really fun. And I enjoy the 87 time period, even though I said last week that I wanted to spend more time in 82, with that cast of characters. We got the Wild Samoans. We got to see another wrestling match. We got some of the wrestling flashbacks. So I thought this was a strong second episode for Young Rock.
Yeah, I really liked the structure. I liked the content. Like I said, I really liked that we're seeing more of a focus on his parents as opposed to just him. Because, I don't think we know a whole lot about, his mom. So learning more about his parents' motivations and things like that, dealing with things that are hidden from Dwayne, it really adds to, I think, that relatability that presidential candidate Dwayne Johnson is looking for.
Another thing I really like about this show is the needle drops that continue to be just littered throughout these episodes. And some of the notable ones from this episode that I really liked were, as I mentioned, Exposé's Point of No Return, which is when the Karens are driving up to the pizza place. I Can't Wait by New Shoes, which is, oh God, I love that song. When Teen Dwayne is asking out Karen in the cafeteria. A song that I am not a big fan of, but I thought was notable because it is in the beginning when Teen Dwayne is dressing up in his purple jeans, is Living on a Prayer by Bon Jovi. The music licensing rights alone must be half of the budget for this show. I think I did see The Rock tease on Twitter that maybe a Young Rock soundtrack is a potential thing that could happen. So
he did say that.
It's really just you type in big 80s hits on Spotify, and that's your Young Rock soundtrack. But I do appreciate the music selections, and I wonder how much of this The Rock has an actual hand in selecting these songs.
Yeah, and that's why I'll be really curious when we get to 1990 and things like that. When we learn more about that time period, what kind of music's going to be playing there.
Yeah.
That's the music I listened to, early 90s.
Well, I'm sure that we'll get a lot of pump-up songs blasting in the weight room of at the University of Miami. Probably a lot of things like I've Got the Power by Snap. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Pro Wrestling Repackaged. Thank you so much for listening. Join us next time for Season 1, Episode 3 of Young Rock.
Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at PWRepackaged and email us at pwrepackaged@gmail.com.
Subscribe on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. And visit pwrepackaged.crd.co for links to everything.
If you'd like to support the show, please consider leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or any other platform that features reviews.
Pro Wrestling Repackaged is a Multitrack Minds production. Visit multitrackminds.com for projects and audio production services by yours truly.